Hello. Today we're going to do retrogrades in the astrology chart, August 13, 2024, class 5 of 6 for astrology basics and level 1. So yesterday I had taught yesterday the psychological astrology group, and I was thinking about what I could teach today, and I decided to teach the retrogrades. We are in Mercury retrograde. And then a few minutes ago, a client of mine sent me a little comic about Mercury. So I'm going to dedicate the class to Mercury when I open the space in a moment. But in addition to talking about general retrogrades in the chart, how many you have, what planets you have them in, what they mean for you in terms of your introspective nature, karma, etc. We are currently in a retrograde cycle with a lot of planets retrograde. So people are feeling this. This is like a very palpable energy in our existence with all of these big transpersonal planets, and now in addition, Mercury being retrograde. So we will look at that in our charts. And if you want to take a peek at the current Mercury, I'll speak to that as well. So I just wanted to start off sharing a little story. I've been observing not only all of these retrogrades because they're in planets that I happen to have retrogrades in, or they're in my sign of Pisces, like Saturn, or opposite my sign, Mercury's now in Virgo. So I'm feeling it. And so this morning I was like, I've got Mercury retrograde in Virgo. What happened 8 years ago? These cycles are from 8 years ago. And I had reached out to an old boss of mine, and she invited me to a project. And it's like people and scenarios and situations start to return back into your life when these planets are transiting. They can be related to your natal retrograde that you'll see in your chart. But if you want to kind of just take a minute and when I'm on your chart, look at where your current retrogrades are, I can do that since we're small. I can do that as well. And for whoever's watching the video, you can reach out to me, A, and B, you'll see the signs that I'm going to mention that they're in. So I just had a very personal anecdote of the impact of a retrograde planet just today. So the archetype is very palpable. So I'm going to share the screen. Can everyone see that? Okay. So again, retrograde is not specific to Mercury. It's any planet but the sun and the moon, which I'll speak to. And some are always retrograde and some are never retrograde, but I'll speak to all of that. I just want to open up the space. So dedicating this class to Hermes or Mercury, which is our personal planet that goes retrograde 3 times a year and currently in retrograde in Virgo. Virgo being the sign of the Christ consciousness, that seed potential that is in all of us. Maybe this retrograde cycle and this class on retrogrades sort of a water that Christ consciousness seed potential in each of you, wherever you have these retrograde planets and Mercury transiting now. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So as I said, we're going to do retrogrades in the chart. I'm going to show you on each of your chart, but this symbol here, the RX, is going to be in your chart in red wherever you have a retrograde planet, and you'll see that. The same as if you're looking at the current cycles, currently Mercury is in retrograde, you will see it in red. That's what's indicated. Anything that is in black is considered direct. Anything that is red is considered retrograde with this symbol, and you'll see that when we do the practical. So today we're going to learn the symbol of the astrology, identify key specific factors that can affect a person or how they would be introspective with a retrograde in each of the planets. We're going to do both the personal planets and the outer planets. And we're going to talk about which planets do not go retrograde. There are some that do not go retrograde, and there are some that are always in retrograde. I'm using the word planet here very loosely, by the way. You'll see when I speak about the nodes in Chiron, those are not planets. So what is a retrograde? What it appears like to us from the Earth, which is our vantage point, is that the planet is going backwards. And most people will speak about failure, will speak about, I'm going backwards. For instance, this job opportunity, it appears to be a step back, right? It's an old position that I did many, many years ago. And that's part of the education, if you will, of a retrograde in the spiritual perspective. As long as there is a movement, we are moving. We have a considering it hierarchically, we're moving forward. So when we take steps back, when we go introspectively inwards, when we revisit a relationship, a job, an old regret, this isn't stuck. This isn't stagnation. In spirituality, the only thing that is stuck is when we're stuck, when we are stagnant, when we are not either moving forward or what we call as humans from our vantage point backwards. So these planets, whether it's transiting or specifically today talking about the ones in your birth chart, gave you a specific introspective insight in that part of your chart by house, by sign, by planet, and of course by aspects, if it has aspects to other planets. And so it's about an internal process. It's supposed to make you feel that you're stopping, you're pausing, you're reflecting, you're introspecting, and go inward and internally into that part of your chart, because there's something there that is still left to learn. There's something there that you sort of fully haven't integrated or worked out internally, that you need a constant sort of revisiting and going backwards, if you will, with any planet in the chart that's retrograde. From an esoteric astrology standpoint, a retrograde will be karmic, that there's still work you have to work through. And the same goes if you don't have any retrogrades. There's a belief, and I have a slide on that briefly, I'll mention it, that if you have no retrogrades, this is your last lifetime. And by last lifetime doesn't mean that you'll never be incarnated again, but this karmic cycle. So those are from the esoteric astrology literature. But for the sake of today, if there is a planet that is retrograde, in addition to needing to go inward and reflect on that aspect of your life and the thematic of that planet and archetype, there's a karmic esoteric belief system that there's karma still there to be worked out in the lifetime, and that is why it's retrograde. So Jung, although he was a psychiatrist, very much believed in astrology and in his model of consciousness and the unconscious mind that is not available to us, being that it's unconscious. He really believed that all of the astrology planets, the entire chart, was what was unconscious, especially planets that were retrograde. And so he says that this is what gives you a very rich, deeper inner world. Sometimes when you don't have a lot of retrogrades, there might be an inclination to more of an external validation. What do other people think? External in the sense that maybe extroverted, not always, but can be. And so what Jung's stance on astrology, and especially retrograde planets, is that they allow you to go deeper into that unconscious mind, whether it's the collective unconscious or your own personal unconscious, and really figure out what's going on in there. And so you tend to have a deep inner life in that particular part of the chart, wherever there is a retrograde planet. From the humanistic psychology standpoint, it's all about self-actualization. If it is something that is causing you to go inward, if it's something that's causing you to reflect back on maybe past decisions or lack of impulsivity so that you can pause, think through something clearly, this is in alignment with the humanistic model, which leads to self-actualization. So the turning inward, the focus inward from a retrograde planet really serves as a catalyst of self-exploration. What's going on? What is this about? What is triggering me? Why am I having this feeling year after year after year, especially when there's transiting planets that can activate your retrograde planet? You might really wonder, how can I change from this, or how can I achieve a full potential utilizing this aspect in my chart? So really, from a humanistic perspective, it's about personal fulfillment. And so if we're looking at burning karma, that's another version of personal fulfillment, and moving through something that perhaps lifetime after lifetime you've been stuck in a pattern. And this may be the lifetime in which you unstick that, if you will. It's advanced astrology, but there's something called a tri-wheel that is 3 charts. And that's the chart of the soul. And it's also known as a progress chart. That will tell you when a planet in your chart that is, you were born with retrograde, will turn direct. There's an actual day that you can see in your progress chart as you live through your life. And a lot of the esoteric literature speaks to that, that if you turn around, if you make a retrograde planet direct, you got it. You got the fulfillment, you got the karmic lesson. It also goes in reverse, right? There might be a planet that's direct that goes retrograde. Maybe something happened in this lifetime that created some karma, and that's why it went retrograde. There's also a belief that if you die with a planet retrograde, that you were born with retrograde, you either really loved that planetary lesson that it taught you. I don't agree with that, because I'm dying with my Mercury retrograde, and I do not believe that. And your soul is saying, give it to me again in the next one. Or there's still some leftover to know, and you haven't fulfilled the potential of that karmic lesson. So this is scratching the surface of many layers and philosophies. So what are the psychological implications? Why does it matter to know why you have retrograde planets in the chart? First of all, this is where you're going to tend to be more internally focused, right? More of your inner world in that part of your chart. Now, we've talked before about incongruities or cognitive dissonance. If you have the sun in a house that's sort of at the bottom of the ocean in the 12th, that it doesn't shine there, correct? It's similar with a retrograde. If you have a retrograde in a house that's already naturally introspective, it may not seem like conflicting, but if it's a retrograde planet in a house that's very social and you're more introverted, that might cause some conflict. But wherever you have a retrograde planet, there is going to be a desire for deep self-reflection and introspection. This is going to be the word reevaluate, reorient, reassess, rethink. Any retrograde planet, you're going to be reconsidering, constantly looking at that part. It's also going to point to very obvious patterns that keep reoccurring in your life, in that house, through that sign, planet, archetype. And it will make sense why, if you believe in the karmic esoteric literature, why this thing keeps reoccurring, so that you can constantly reevaluate and perhaps shift the pattern, get out of the pattern, expand from the pattern, and change internally. That will then in turn change your external life. And going back to that progress chart, if you see that the planet turned direct, you can start to have almost like a confirmation of the inner work that you're doing. It's an opportunity to look at your challenges from an internal standpoint, right? This challenge came up in my personal life, in my work life, in my outward life, but really there's something internally for me to learn here. So it reorients and redirects your stance and your viewpoint to look at something from internal, and an opportunity for personal growth. You're also tackling obstacles from a place where you can control, right? If you're looking at things from an inner stance, then you now know what you are in control of in that area of your chart and that area of your life. And so it benefits you in the sense of saying, okay, wait, I can't control the external. I'm not externally focused in this particular area. this is something internally in me, and looking at the things that are in your control. Retrogrades give you unique problem-solving abilities in that particular place of your life, particularly because it's a pattern that continuously appears. You probably get very crafty at figuring things out. I was actually looking at Jen's chart this morning, and I didn't remember what she had in retrograde. And Jen and I are 2 months apart. So a lot of things are similar, but a lot of things are not. And it happens to be that a planet that I have direct, she has retrograde, and two that I have retrograde, she has direct. And I had never noticed that aspect of her chart. And one of the things that Jen will tell you is that she's very, very crafty around things with her children, their education, and that's exactly where she has the retrograde. So it really speaks to how she thinks in terms of that area and finding really unique ways to grow and help those people that occupy that house. In her case, it's the 5th house of children. It gives you enhanced emotional sensitivity and empathy. If you have been continuously hit with a pattern, with a problem in an area of life, you start to learn empathy for others that might be experiencing the same thing. And so oftentimes that empathy grows, you're attuned to people that are having difficulties in that area of their life because you've been through so much, you looked at something introspectively, and you've had a pattern that you've had to reevaluate. So it really helps in growing your understanding and compassion for others as well that are struggling with similar facets in life. So the personal planets, we're going to go through the personal planets, and then we're going to go through the outer planets so that you have an idea of each one, and then you'll see which ones are in your chart. So these are the list of the personal planets. I said in the objectives that you would learn which planets do not go retrograde. The sun and the moon do not go retrograde. They will never be retrograde. However, the black moon goes retrograde and goes retrograde often. It is not uncommon that your black moon will be retrograde and then in a progressed back and forth. So that's not a planet that we consider in terms of the longevity of how long a retrograde is in. The nodes are always retrograde. So if you have them in your chart, they will indeed be retrograde. The most that they can do is become stationary, which is pretty much the same thing. So you'll see a little S, and if any of you have that, I'll point it out. But the nodes are always retrograde, both the north and the south node. So the sun and the moon will never be retrograde. It's impossible. Mercury, Venus, and Mars may be retrograde in your chart. So those will be the personal planets. If you have a retrograde Mercury, you're very reflective in terms of your thinking, in terms of, it does not mean that you're shy. I have Mercury retrograde. There's nothing shy about me. However, I'm an extremely reflective person, introspective. And so it gives you that kind of inner dialogue. Pay attention to your thoughts, think about things more intently and more deeply. Mind you that this is just the planet. We're not talking about everything in the chart that obviously is going to play as a whole. That's why I said it may not be that person's shy. They just may be introspective, specifically in the house in which they have the retrograde planet. You may reconsider how you think about things, reconsider other people's opinions or thoughts about how they have tackled problems, and it makes you, again, in more of the thinking and communication style that Mercury rules, to become more introspective. Now, currently Mercury is retrograde for everybody. Okay, this I'm talking about is in your natal chart, not the transiting. But the transits are similar. In Mercury retrograde, what are the most common things we hear? The computer broke, my papers got lost, right? Those are kind of the things that people are hung up around Mercury retrograde. Why would the papers get lost? Maybe you need to revisit them. Maybe you need to submit it at another time when you're not in such a hurry. Maybe you didn't have all the credentials and qualifications and you need to clean them up, right? So if we go deeper to the meaning of a retrograde, we get to the response or the answer that the universe is trying to give us. Perhaps slow down. Again, it appears to be going backwards. So maybe retrace your steps, go back to a time where this has entered your life. How are you going to do it differently? So we can use the teaching of retrograde even for the transiting ones, as specifically Mercury, because Mercury transits retrograde 3 times a year. So people are very conscious of this, and it's in modern day parlance. Mars. Mars has to do with autonomy, assertiveness, and our direct action. So if Mars is retrograde, that person might not be so impulsive to act, or they realize they make a very impulsive or ambitious stance, and they stop and say, oh, wait, I take that back. And so you see that perhaps that directness is a little shifting, or even if they are direct, because Mars is a very direct planet and a very assertive planet, they might reconsider their stance after a while, or they may not even, depending on the sign in the house, be impulsive. They might really rethink before they take any charge. Mars is a planet that also rules fear and courage, bravery. So if it's retrograde, you may have to check all your boxes before you even take that leap, and that can feel as if it's stagnant, but in certain respects, it can really benefit a person, maybe not in all of them. And their approach to goal setting or tackling goal might be more introspective. What do I gain from this from a soul perspective, or my internal, not just the external outcome? Venus is related to relationships, primarily love, romantic relationships, and also self-worth. It's the way we see ourselves in our self-image. So if you have a Venus that's retrograde, you might find yourself repeating the same relationship over and over and over and over again. And you have to reevaluate what it is that you're attracting in the partner, why you're attracted to that, and do a little self-exploration as to your values, what you define as love, what you want in affection and in an intimate partner. And it has to do with pleasures. Venus is very much about a pleasure seeking. So you might reorient or reconsider what you're considering that is pleasure. Are they internal desires that you want pleased? Maybe a little less than the external desires as well. Any questions on the personal planets? These go retrograde quite often, just so you know. So it's not uncommon to see the personal planets in a chart in a person retrograde. And like I was using the example of Jen, one person a month or a few days later can have a retrograde, and a friend born in the same month can have it direct. So this is very common that these planets are retrograde frequently, unlike the outer planets. So the outer planets are Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. These are considered generational planets. So for instance, right now, Neptune is retrograde. Anybody that is born from now, a little bit ago, to November, that entire subset of the population is going to have a Neptune that's retrograde at the same degree. So there's you can look at generations from a larger 10-year perspective. If you look at astrological generations, oftentimes it has to do with the transit that everybody has Jupiter and Gemini. And then within that, there's a subset that has Jupiter and Gemini retrograde. So it also fine-tunes sort of these generational similarities in people when you look at charts. If I were to have a child now with Neptune in Sagittarius, Neptune in Pisces retrograde, and my Neptune in Sagittarius retrograde, there would be a learning experience that would have to happen, right? So we can also see this when we look at couples or family systems, generations of retrograde, or certain planets that are retrograde across a generation or across a family system. That's not uncommon to look at that, because there's something there karmically and the soul needs to learn. So Jupiter has all to do about philosophy, growth, belief, religion, mythology, psychology, all of these type of themes. And someone who has a Jupiter retrograde might be more about internalizing those spiritual teachings. Maybe they're not the overt, go to the ashram or go to the church every week, but they have a very deep spiritual religious belief system that they just kind of do in the privacy of their own home. Again, this has to do with where the planet is in your chart, but that would be like a Jupiter in Cancer retrograde or a Jupiter in Sagittarius retrograde in the 4th. That would be probably someone who considers maybe their home their temple, or their own physical body their temple. And that's where they apply these spiritual philosophical belief systems. Saturn, the planet Saturn already is a responsible, dutiful planet. So if you have a Saturn in a placement, and on top of that, it's retrograde, it is a certain nuance of even more duty, more responsibility, more inflexibility, more of a struggle, because the limitations that you've imposed on yourself in that part of your chart, you're doing because it's very internalized adulting, if you will, very internalized responsibility and duty. And so Saturn retrogrades have to be worked on mentally, because you're imposing a value system on that area in your life that it should look a certain way. And that's Saturn naturally, but retrograde makes you even add a more restrictive layer. There's another RE, another restrictive layer to an already restrictive planet. Uranus is all about change, uniqueness, innovation, sudden changes. So if you have retrograde, you might be very quick to change, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an inner dissonance as to what's going on and why you're doing it. So this could be a tricky placement for a retrograde, because Uranus is all about quick and fast and sudden. And so if you're quick, fast, and sudden in that place of your life, but then all of a sudden you've jumped too fast and too far, you have to reflect after the fact if you land, right? And it already is a planet that wants you to be very individual, unique, original, and seek freedom. And if it's retrograde, again, the reflection might come after the fact, because the desire for the unique experience and the originality is just by nature of the planet. And you might be reconsidering or rethinking once, like I said, you're in mid-air, once you've already jumped off the cliff, if you will. Neptune is about spirituality, dreams, anything has to do with the unconscious and spirituality. It's also linked to delusion and a very, very heightened imagination. So if an imagination already kind of takes you a bit out of the body, if you will, dissociates you from this sort of, sensory world, imagine a Neptune retrograde. That enhances that already. I have a Neptune retrograde in my 1st. I'm already uber Pisces and was super dissociated. I didn't need the help of an additional retrograde planet in my 1st to make me even more loopy, right? And so I had to work that. And I said before, I'm going to die with a Neptune retrograde in my 1st. That will be a constant, and it serves me for my spiritual purposes and for connecting to all the different realms. But in the 1st house, which is about my presence here, you can see that I used to be like, ooh, somewhere off in another land. And so you see where the placement is, the meaning of the planet, and of course the sign that it's in. In mine, it's Sagittarius. So I went off on philosophy and religion and mythology that was a benefit. But you can see how each retrograde has a shadow side as well. Pluto is transformation. Naturally, wherever you have Pluto, you're going to reinvent yourself. It's going to be this alchemical process that is just an automatic, natural. But if you have a Pluto retrograde, and this is also very generational, the ability to go inward to make change is really fast. There's a sort of deeper self-examination that even just wherever you have Pluto naturally is, this really leads to a transformative and personal growth and a transmutation that could be pretty profound pretty quickly. does not always come pain-free. Nothing Pluto offers is pain-free. So it's a kind of like, be careful what you wish for. If you want to retrograde Pluto, but then you get it, you're going to feel every single teaching. So that all that self-growth and personal development is going to come at a cost. Chiron. So Chiron is not a planet, like the nodes are not planets. So the nodes are never, like I said before, are never direct or always retrograde, but they're not planets. Chiron is an asteroid, like the Black Moon Lilith. The Black Moon Lilith, we really, like I said, it changes day to day. So it's not necessarily a heavy placement of retrograde. It doesn't mean that in the person's psyche it doesn't have effect. It absolutely does, but it's not something that you can really like boil down to a month. It's a day by day, like the moon that moves daily. Chiron, however, is also very generational and has to do with the wounded child, has to do with the deepest wound according to self-worth and this idea that we're imperfect and will always be imperfect. So people with Chiron retrograde may have a very deep exploration of their core wounds. They're very, very drawn into this journey of where did this wound come from? How does it dominate? How can I heal it? How can I overcome it? It's a natural sign of the teacher. So if your Chiron is retrograde and you've done a lot of that deep self-exploration and you've looked at your trauma, your emotional pain, your childhood wounds, most likely in some capacity, you're going to be that wounded healer, wounded teacher archetype that you're going to teach back what you learned about your own journey. So it's a very marked placement when it's retrograde. It gives a lot of deep introspection to that specific area of the life, especially a childhood and deep wounds. And of course, depending on the house it's in. So if it's in the 7th with relationships, and of course, the wounding at childhood that perhaps led to my marriage, for instance. So we add it up. Any questions about retrograde through the planets so that you have a better understanding of your own chart? Sometimes you will have two planets that are conjunct. They're side by side on a chart. One is retrograde and one is direct, and they impact each other. Conjuncts are like a tattoo. If you had a tattoo sleeve, it's something you cannot remove. They work in tandem. And so if one is retrograde and one is not, you can see how they would impact one another, especially if they're personal planets. This is Venus, this is Mars, two personal planets. So the personal planets, your day-to-day momentum, how you move. And so if one's retrograde and one's not, you can see that maybe you have this back and forth motion, maybe something you're very externally driven by, but then the other planet says, no, stop, go inward. And you can see this sort of foot on the brake, foot on the accelerator motion in the chart with the planets, and of course, what house they're in. This back and forth motion of, am I external, am I internal? Do I become introspective and pause and reflect, or do I act and become impulsive? This attitude can cause for a lot of internal conflict because you're not guided in one direct direction, right? Both planets aren't saying forward, go forth. One is holding back and you can feel almost like you're being pulled and tugged. It's not as dramatic as an opposition that we covered a few months back, but it has that flavor that it can kind of pull you in opposite directions. Jung, and one of Jung's key teachings, and I mentioned this in the oppositions class, is what causes growth is the tension of opposites. So even though these are not opposites, they're conjoined twins, if you will, they still cause a friction that make us feel that we're in opposition with something that we want to do or say, and then what we do and say, and that tension of opposites always leads to the greatest growth. So these are not negative things. They just, again, like Pluto, they cost. So what if you have no retrograde planets? I mentioned before, from the karmic astrology, esoteric astrology literature, it is believed that it is your last lifetime. Some people believe a complete disembodiment, never again. That is not my belief system. However, I do believe, and I've read for few people who have no retrograde planets, that this particular cycle of 8 lifetimes, if you will, is over, and then they're going to start over. If you want more about the 8 lifetime stuff, that's all in my my book on the shadow side of the mother's love, I talk about the different lifetimes and what they represent, and they're linked to the phases of the moon. So it's believed that there's 8 that we share with a certain group of people. And so some of the literature speaks to that, that the 8 group of those 8 lifetimes with that group of people with no retrogrades, you're done with that, and then the you start new. But some people believe that full disembodiment, you're done and you've actualized and you're not returning. So that's for you to decide. So if you don't have retrograde planets, or you have one, let's say, that one will be very focused in the chart, will take up a lot of your energy. So it's not that having one is any less important or weighted as having several, because it'll just be the emphasis will be on those that you have 1 or 4. It does not matter. But if you don't have any, or you tend to have most planets direct, you're going to be more outward focused, right? You might be more concerned with what people think. You might be more concerned with external, right, outcomes, what's in your hand, what is tangible. I can feel it, I can touch it, I can smell it, I can taste it. That aspect of the directedness or the external living would be more perhaps psychologically important than someone who has more introspection and that gain internally. It doesn't mean that one's better or worse, or that you don't have both. We all have both, but the focus might be. It also might be the way your personality is, right? Maybe this makes you uber external in terms of your optimism or extroversion, right? So you might have a lot of forward momentum. Maybe you don't think things through for days and days and days, and you just kind of act. There's less internal conflict, not because you're less conflicted, but if you're not as introspective, you may just be like, oh, they're the problem, right? And then you move on. So it depends on the way in which you look at things. The external orientation, you might express yourself very clear and very well. There could be a leaning towards more of a direct approach rather than considering your words and maybe just saying whatever you think. And we all know people like that, right? Oh, I'm just very direct. I say what it is, when I want, as I want it. And so even though they might leave a wake for another person, maybe for themselves, is I got it off my chest, and they feel great. And maybe for them that's harmony within. And they might lack, doesn't have to be, depending on the belief system, they might lack depth because they don't have that sort of introspective capacity and focus, like I said, on outward or external achievement. And it doesn't mean that someone doesn't have a deep inner life, but maybe the external and the outward, what's expressed that people can see, is really valued. So what we're going to do now in the practical, you want to go to your chart and identify, first of all, how many and which planets are retrograde. The planet that is retrograde is first of importance, because that's going to tell you what part of your life you're going to be introspected in, right? Venus, love and self-worth and image, your desires, your pleasures. Mercury, the way you think, the way you talk, the way you sort of have inner conflict or inner dialogue, right? So that's first. That's the first thing that we'll look. And we want to look at which planets you have. And then, of course, the house. Because like I said, if you have a Chiron retrograde in the 7th and you continuously have these relationships, because once you want to discuss childhood issues with your partner and they say, nope, that's not something I'm interested in discovering, and the relationship splits off, you can see now the reason for that being. The nodes I mentioned are always retrograde and the black moon, so we're not going to look at those. Again, it's not that the black moon doesn't impact retrograde or direct, it's just very sort of fleeting. And identify if the house, so now we're talking about the house, that the retrograde is this an area that you have a lot of retrospect in? Do you rethink, reconsider, reorient, revalue over and over and over again? Usually the way we interpret that psychologically is we're wrong, right? Oh, I should have done this, I should have done that. But we have to remember that this is an inward orientation. That's why there's no right or wrong. I should have done is an external expression of something, right? And it's a comparison. But should I have done it? Is this right for me? Does this orient to my value, to my inner world? That's really the place in which you answer the question of a retrograde. And then if you have none, are you externally motivated and influenced by others? Any questions on that before we look at the charts?
I have a question, actually.
Yes.
So my question is, if what I've got in retrograde, have I got it in retrograde for all of my life?
Yes, this is your natal chart. However,
Yeah.
what I mentioned before, and I'll give a sneak peek so you have a visual.
Yeah.
If you have something retrograde in your case, okay, so here's the node. That's not it. This doesn't count. That's Vulcan. Your retrograde is Chiron. So Chiron, Aries in the fourth. I have the exact same placement. I know it well. So I can telepathically tell you what's going on there. So it may or may not, and I'll just give you a sneak peek so you can kind of see what I'm talking about, this tri-wheel or this progressed wheel, and there's a whole astrology about progressed charts. That is specifically soul-based astrology. It takes all of the retrogrades, it takes everything, but specifically for today, the retrogrades, and sees if it ever goes direct. So just for a visual, I want to show you that. So this is the progress chart. This is your natal chart. There's your Chiron retrograde in Aries at 20 degrees, or at 6 degrees in the fourth house. This is how it's progressed throughout your life. You're currently even more retrograde, 4 degrees Chiron. That's not uncommon. Once something is retrograde, it tends to continue retrograding. It may or may not ever flip. You may die with that retrograde. At this pace, most likely. And so this is just going to be that area where there's going to be a lot of introspection. So the fourth house has to do with your inner life. So of all the places to have one retrograde, it is in the most introspective house of the entire chart. So there's going to be a very deep introspective, even though everything else is direct. Everything else is direct. Again, nodes and Vulcan don't count. This already is in a very introspective house. The fourth house is the unconscious house. The fourth house is a water house. The fourth house is our family systems house. So the wound of Chiron, the neglect, the child wound, the inner child work, all of that is going to go inward and inward and inward and inward in a place where you're repeatedly going to go back to those examples or those stories or those narratives for learning, to revisit. Did I outgrow a pattern? Did I outgrow a narrative? Did I grow from what a wound in childhood represented? To boot, it's in Aries. Aries is a sign of the identity. Chiron, everybody has a Chiron, and every Chiron asks a question. This Chiron asks, who am I? Chiron in Aries always asks, who am I? So you're going to continuously throughout life ask yourself, who am I? It's going to be oriented from a place of self. Who am I, perhaps myself in this group? Who am I as myself in this relationship? Right? We start with that retrograde where you are in that case, and then we extrapolate out. Now, in your particular case, and I'm just going to speak to this, you have an opposition to Uranus and Jupiter. So this introspection also is going to be tearing you in two when you want to be spontaneous and original and fun and seek personal development. It's probably going to be triggered by a question. Who am I? This experience is going to give me the answer. The other beautiful thing about this opposition is that it's in the 10th house. You're going to eventually teach or give as a career focused ideal or program or opportunity. This experience, this lived experience here, as is who am I? This is a sign of the teacher, and this is original teaching, that you're going to take your lived experience and give it to the world in some sort of vocation or professional capacity, because this is your vantage point. Your vantage point is Chiron retrograde, who am I? What's my identity from my childhood, from my home, from within? And then the opposition says, give it outward, because this is an outward inward expression, and this is an outward expression. So I just want to make a shout out. Tomorrow's Martin Leo's birthday. So happy birthday. So any questions on your retrograde?
No, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I'm departing as well, so I'm
Yes.
just going to say goodbye. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, and enjoy your travels. Okay, Haley. Haley, did you get a chance to see class from yesterday? I spoke about your chart. So what is
I
Haley?
did. I watched that last night. Thank you.
Oh, so okay. And this just speaks to everything in the 12. Haley's chart's phenomenal. Okay, so your retrograde here is Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn. Every single outer planet. Now, again, generational. So 1990, generational. Of course, she's born in July. I can't speak to how long. Some of these planets are retrograde for months and months and months, right? So it could be an entire generational, like year, where everybody has that. But every single outer planet is retrograde. So we'll talk about the Pluto in the 4th in a minute, which is just a very marked placement. But 90% of Haley's chart is in the 12th house. And the 12th house is about merging with one, the interconnectedness of it all, right? So if all this introspection from these planets that seem to be external, that seem to be so far away, now becomes so in. You have the solar system here all day, 24/7, looking and looking and looking and looking, and that's me, and that's me, and that's, there's a constant interconnectedness from the stance of this chart. And notice how all of the retrogrades are sort of on this quadrant, right? And so you're looking towards your retrospection is on how do we unite as one? How are we a family? All of that in Cancer, right? Of a universal family. How do I, work 6th house where all of these planets are, work to unite a humanity, to unite a collective, to make everyone part of my family, to see how we are all interrelated. It's a very fascinating placement with all of these retrogrades. So at work, needless to say, you're probably going to go back to old jobs. Maybe, I don't know if you've experienced that, especially with that Saturn in retrograde, or the same type of boss, right? You might have key mythological figures. These are all, gods that the universe was split for these type of gods. So if the gods are your bosses, 6th house, we'll talk about 4th in a second, you probably encounter the same type of person over and over and over. If it's not the exact same job, you'll probably have that repeated. And the function of that retrograde in work or as a supervisor, as a boss that repeats, is so that you can again say, even that type of person, even that fill in the blank negative adjective is me. You were going to say something.
I was just realizing that I've had so many work relationships with Virgos, and all of that is 6th house placement. So,
and the Mercury that's Virgo now, even though your 6th house is ruled by Capricorn, what she's speaking to is that Virgo is the ruler of the 6th house. So what I opened with was the Christ consciousness. All of these retrogrades are to teach you the Christ consciousness, not from a low level consciousness of, duty and responsibility. That's not why you're at work. You're at work to emerge as a sage. You're at work to emerge as a transcendent function of this experience. That's the Christ consciousness that wants to be sort of the potential birth, so that then all of this can come to fruition. When someone has their sun touching the ascendant, but through the 12th house, because Jen has it touching through the 1st, this is the end. It's a full circle. This is the beginning of life. This is the end of life. You unite the individual and the universal. You will accomplish the soul's desire with this chart. One hell of a way to get there. You'll have to write the memoir. You know, I know it's not going to be easy with what I'm looking at, but it's fascinating. It really is. Your chart is fascinating. When I spoke to it yesterday, I was like blown away. Every time I look at it from a different angle, I'm just blown away. Pluto in the 4th in Scorpio retrograde. Girlfriend, one day you'll have to sit and tell me how the hell you live that, because that's one hell of a placement. First of all, anybody who has Pluto in the 4th, any sign, retrograde or direct, does not matter, comes to be the person in the family that does different. There's no manual. They sure as hell know that that isn't what they want. That's what they know. It is like an internal knowing. Making that Scorpio, which is already the sign that's ruled by that Pluto rules, introspective in the 4th house, transcendent in the 4th house, transmutative, alchemical, the capacity. I'll tell you what I just saw visually. The capacity to transmute more and more and more and introspect and reflect and do it again in order for you to carry this constant opposition of the world and what it throws at you. This is what's balancing. I just saw Atlas carrying the world on its shoulder. This is Atlas, and this is the world on your shoulders. And because of that, you can do it. And with a little help with our friend Lilith over here. It's pretty magical. Combined today with what we did yesterday, that's one hell of a reading. Go forth. Change us all. Carissa. Okay, Carissa has Pluto. Okay, so generationally, yours, also a hell of a placement. In the 12th, but it's Sag, conjunct Chiron. Now, Pluto Chiron, this is my children's generation, 99-2000. Everyone in that generation has this. Abby has it somehow. Luna has it. That entire generation has Pluto Chiron. If Chiron is the inner child, the wounded child, and they come to kind of transmute, shatter that, right? It can also be the larger wound of the world, right? Chiron being the ruler of the 6th house work, we see a lot of generational resistance to a traditional work that us older people have. And it's because of this. They want to transform the work. They want to transform what is viewed as Christ consciousness. They want to transform and transmute this belief of being wounded is bad and being all accepting of oneself with their cracks and things. So you see generationally how that reflects. It's retrograde in the 12th. I didn't mention this in the PowerPoint. Things that are retrograde in the 12th are very, very hard to access. Because anything in the 12th is already hard to access because it's so in the unconscious that you need a mirror. When it's retrograde, it's doubly hard to access. So part of what's happening is you must look at your dreams. You must look at others for a constant reflection of what that's trying to suppress. It would be very interesting to know what your mom was going through in pregnancy that she herself was trying to suppress with that. You're being asked to carry a very big load psychically, but the funny thing, different to Haley's, which is very global, she's carrying the world on her shoulders, you're carrying a personal wounding on your shoulders. I'm guessing it's mom.
Always.
It could be because she's here in the 9th and 10th. This sector is parents, right? The 10-4 is parents, but it's there. There's because it's the 9th and philosophically and stuff like that. So you're being asked to carry a personal wound and making it universal, and it's not. That's an interesting, tricky space. I'm probably guessing that's why you shoved it into the 12th. What else do you have retrograde? Okay, you've got Uranus retrograde and you've got Neptune retrograde. So again, this impulsivity, maybe your original, right? This is an original placement. It's in the second. You want to be original, but then you overthink it. How original can I be? It's in Aquarius when I'm supposed to be part of a collective. There has to be that question going on. Neptune, very transcendental, very spiritual, but again, what's the universal collective saying about this? And again, maybe not as difficult because Neptune doesn't like to be in the second anyway. You're always going to have a self-worth issue with that. And there's a lot of reflecting. Yeah, Neptune in the second, just like a moon in the second. They don't like to be there. They're very like self-facing. Why did I do that? Why did I say that? But your originality, your capacity to make impulsive choices, make decisions, really honor a value system, that is pulled back. But it's all here in the second, and then this 12th. So if we look at the 12th and the second in combination, again, it's exactly what I said here. I didn't notice. What is personal? What is individual that you're making universal? And vice versa, who gave you the universal task of their own personal problem? That's really that. Yeah. Any questions?
No, I'm gonna write that down though, and then I'm gonna write about it later.
Okay. Yeah.
What is okay? Wait, will you say it again though? What is personal that you're making universal?
Yeah, and I do think you got this from your mom. Definitely your parents. Whoever's in your 410 axis is guiding this. But something that was like a personal, I don't want to say vendetta, that's not the word, a personal mission that was given to you almost as if it was a universal mission. And it's not, it's personal. And your job, and it's difficult with your Uranus and Moon and Neptune in the second, and 2 of those planets are retrograde, like questioning what is yours, that what is mine that's personal, second house, versus the 12th house, what is universal. There's a difference there. You don't have to fight everyone's fight, but that's how it was sort of sold to you. So that parsing is important.
Okay,
and
thank
Jen,
you.
You're welcome. Your only planet, which I had not noticed, is Saturn retrograde in Gemini in the 5th. And it's like, can it be more perfect? And so it is opposite the moon and your Venus, a little far from the Neptune, but it impacts this, like Martin, that opposition. If your standpoint of my children, my own individuation, right? That's the perspective of Saturn. What I said before was Saturn is already a very responsible, dutiful, limited space. And then to add to that, and it is Gemini, so a lot of logos, a lot of logic going on there, in a house that's ruled by the heart, right? And so part of the job of this particular retrograde is, okay, there are certain things that are logical, but the matters of the heart are the matters of the heart. One of those being your children, 5th house, and the other being self. The 5th house is about our soul. It's not about external things. And so the retrograde here is a constant reflection of, I think, opening and melting to those limitations and duties and responsibilities that are supposed to be seen versus those that should be felt. And then you have the exact opposition of Venus Moon. You can't get more feminine, felt, sensory than Venus Moon. And so the perspective from here is saying, become that Venus Moon, become more desirous, become more pleasure filled, which is all what opens the heart, right? Because that leads to indulgences, that leads to vulnerabilities, that leads to seeing different things because I feel my way through. I'm not thinking my way through. Sound a little like you?
Yes.
Just a little bit, just a little bit. Okay. Okay, Jen was gonna be out today. She's got Jupiter in retrograde and she's got Pluto and Leo in retrograde in the 4th. Okay, so the same thing I said for Haley. Now Haley's was a little bit over here. So I'm assuming that your transmutation comes a little later in life. The 4th house is one of those houses that represent the life cycle. So wherever the placement is, this was probably a transmutation that she had, or an aha, or a sudden shift of life from one minute to the other that made her realize, it's Leo, I got to take care of myself. Something in this home isn't right, right? So just like you, Haley, yours is a little over here. Yours might be coming later in life as you get closer to understanding what's yours to carry as Atlas and what's not. And so this is an interesting placement also for major transmutation. Her only other planet is Jupiter in Gemini. It's the ruler of the planet in the first house of identity, but it's retrograde, and it's also in Gemini. So an identity here might be in conflict, where I'm supposed to be expansive and outgoing, and I know everything that I am, and I'm all about the good times, but then there's this reflective retrograde that's like overthinking, maybe lashing out, you know, physically saying, oh, that's not the right way to behave. And that probably with age, because again, it's towards later in life, has started to gain a different perspective. The Jupiter here is opposite the sun. And so if this is a very philosophical leaning, this is a very personal growth leaning in terms of, I should represent growth, I should represent expansion. But again, the thoughts are somewhat introspective because it's retrograde. From this standpoint, she actually starts developing, which is very beautiful, the sun in the seventh house. The sun, I mentioned before, does not like to be in the seventh house. It doesn't like to share. But this retrograde probably, it's not I'm the end all be all, Jupiter takes up all the space in the first house of I am. Probably the retrograde made her kind of have to go inward a little and realize, wait, maybe I have to adapt and adjust. It is Gemini after all. And makes this sun feel a bit at home in the seventh, where I know how to play in the sandbox with others. So that opposition actually, I believe, has probably helped that sun feel at home in a place that it doesn't feel at home, because it doesn't like to share. And if this may not have been retrograde, that sharing capacity and playing nice with others might have been more difficult. And this Pluto was a very early onset, oh my God, I have to figure this out. Like the changes inside, and that probably also helped that. And the Pluto is exact trine to the sun. So that's a real capacity for transformation. That's a person that can like transform over and over and over. And it probably started very young and helped this Jupiter not be so grandiose and narcissistic. Any questions before we go? I'm just going to take a moment. I'm going to use my chart just so you guys can see. If you want to go a little deeper in terms of retrograde and what's happening now, everybody has Mercury retrograde in Virgo. So find your Virgo house, and that's right now where you're revisiting. And so I today had a very visceral lived experience of this. And because it's in Virgo, as I said in the opening, it's about our Christ consciousness. Something is trying to rebirth itself or birth itself from a potential you've always had. You just didn't work through it, and now is the opportunity. The other thing about a retrograde transit Mercury is that it's reflecting 8 years ago. So ask yourself in that section of your chart, wherever you have it, what are you revisiting? What from 8 years ago needs to go and be reconsidered? There's that view going on. We currently, everybody, Saturn in Pisces retrograde, Neptune in Pisces retrograde, a lot for Pisces, Virgo, Gemini, and Sag. If you have anything in those 4 placements, you're getting hit in some capacity because it's just a lot of retrograde going on. Pluto just went retrograde. It's its last hurrah. It's going to Capricorn. It's finally, after 24 years, leaving Capricorn, and it's the last slap. So Capricorns, Aries, Libras, and Cancers, you're getting your last slap. And then Tauruses, Aquariuses, Scorpios, and what did I miss? And Aquariuses are going to get the Pluto by November, I think. And that's it. We're done with Pluto and Capricorn, and now we have 12 to 20 years of Pluto in Aquarius. So you could see a lot of the outward planets, kind of like Haley's chart, where you had all of those transpersonal planets in retrograde. This generation is being born now, similar. Saturn, Pluto, Neptune. It's a lot. It's very heavy. And then we learn to kind of navigate that. Okay, ladies. I'm going to close up. Thank all of our gods, internal gods that allow us to reflect on our divine and not so divine qualities. Mercury especially, shout out. Thank you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, girls.
you.
See you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Good to see you guys.
You too.